I'd love to see the WoW devs do their own version of 14's live letters on a regular basis. Not just 10-minute video on the new patch, but a proper deep dive into stuff for an hour or two. I think one of the reasons that doesn't happen, and it shows the kind of the difference between Final Fantasy XIV and WoW, I still maintain that, honestly, the biggest fundamental difference between Final Fantasy XIV and WoW is not even the way that Final Fantasy XIV focuses storytelling. The main difference between Final Fantasy XIV and WoW, honestly, is that Final Fantasy XIV, their classes are complete standard. Everyone who's playing Dragoon is playing the same Dragoon. Like, the only difference is gear, and gear doesn't affect any of your abilities apart from stats. Whereas in WoW, we have this liking and this insistence on being able to modify and variety and change up what our characters actually do with talent trees and gear that gives special effects and trinkets that give us new abilities, essentially. And what that does is it creates a much more difficult balancing issue. Like, it's so much harder to balance WoW than it is Final Fantasy XIV. But it means that even more than that, a lot more of the conversation around WoW is always about class balance and, you know, class sets and anything that affects that balance, like gear and stuff like that. And that's a conversation that just doesn't exist in anywhere near the same degree with Final Fantasy XIV. So Yoshi and his buddies can do a live letter and know that they are going to be able to talk about just shit that they want to talk about, and the conversation isn't just going to always go back to class balance. Whereas we saw in like Josh and Ian's dev interviews that they used to do, that always used to happen. You get a few questions out, but if they didn't talk for like half an hour about class balance and why this bit of class balance isn't working and what are their plans to fix this bit of class balance and do you know that this 4-piece isn't working and blah, blah, blah. If they didn't spend most of the Q&A talking about that, then you get people going, oh, they were just dodging questions. They were cherry picking questions and they clearly didn't want to talk about class balance. But then if you do just talk about class balance the whole time, like, that's incredibly boring and dull. So I feel like, you know, there's greater scope to have live letters with Yoshi and Final Fantasy XIV because the conversation doesn't always come back to class balance like it does with WoW. And that's not because Final Fantasy XIV devs are awesome at class balance and WoW devs aren't. It's because WoW, like, balancing WoW is literally like 200 times harder than balancing Final Fantasy XIV. I remember them talking about the Demonology Warlock in, I think it was at the end of WoD, and how it low-key sounded like, yeah, don't play that. It wasn't low-key, it was explicit. They said, yeah, we don't want you playing that spec right now. We're going to come back and fix it. It was at the end of WoD, and they were like, we're going to come back and fix that next expansion, and at the moment, we just don't really want people playing it. So we've made that obvious in the nerfs that we've given it. But each class spec is 99% the same for all raiders. The choice is an illusion, as everyone reads a guide to min-max. That doesn't really matter. Like, the fact that like, balance is changed by, like, the fact that you can swap out abilities, the fact that there is armor and weapons that change your abilities, right? Like, you know, there are 12 classes in this game. There are 36 specs in this game. And every single one of them has gear that can sync with some of their abilities and completely, like, out of nowhere, make them OP or underpowered if they don't sync up as well as with other classes and things like that. Like, even if you just take out the talent swapping and things like that, which you shouldn't because it's a massive deal, but even if you do just take out that, WoW still, because we insist, has tier sets and gear that changes our abilities. Like, 2 of our gear slots are specifically designed to change our abilities in trinkets and give us, like, extra abilities. And some of those might work much better for some classes than for other classes and things like that. Like, apart from anything, like, literally, Final Fantasy XIV doesn't even have trinkets that can change things up. Like, their kind of base of abilities for classes is so strict and so even across the board. There's nothing that can change it up. You know, the only thing that changes up is the stats that come from your gear. It's as simple as that. You know, they don't even have trinkets that can do that. And even just introducing that into the mix adds so many variables and so many headaches. And then when you introduce, like, gear sets that do the same thing, then when you introduce the fact that everyone's got, like, 10 rows of talents or whatever that they can swap out with 3 options each, I mean, yeah, it's difficult. And then, like, you know, you've got all of that within Raid and within Mythic Plus and within PvP. And I know like Final Fantasy XIV has that as well, but it has so many less variables to be playing with. And, you know, we all know that. I'm not saying anything controversial here. I'm not teaching you anything. But I do think that is genuinely a reason why things like the developer Q&As in World of Warcraft don't work quite as well as the live letters in Final Fantasy XIV, is because class balance is so much more of an issue in World of Warcraft, because there's so much more to balance, and because, as well, competitive play is more of a thing in World of Warcraft, so the balance is more important to more people. Inevitably, the conversation is so focused around balance. When I'm in the Final Fantasy XIV community, I see conversations about balance, but nothing like on the level that we see with World of Warcraft. With World of Warcraft, it's almost always, inevitably, one of the main topics of conversation with everything. You know, most of the conversation that surrounded covenants was around the balance of the covenants. Most of the conversation around any new feature is around class balance and how it impacts that. So at the end of the day, any conversation about WoW with the devs, unfortunately, will kind of circle back to that. It's like Godwin's law, right? It'll always come back to balance. And you saw that in live Q&As. I've sat there at BlizzCon when a new expansion has been announced, okay? And I've seen like people going through the questions, deciding what questions are going to be in the Q&A. And the amount of balance questions in the BlizzCon developer Q&A for WoW that were put in the little fucking box is mind-blowing, like staggering. If these new talents work as intended, you can actually alter your playstyle and still be viable. I much prefer WoW's approach. What's viable, though? That's the thing, Tank and Funk. Like, what is viable? Because if you look at classes in WoW right now, they're all viable. Like, my criteria for a class being viable is that you can get ahead of the curve, and that you can get Keystone Master, and that you can get, like, vicious whatever in PvP. Like, that's my criteria for classes being viable. And anything like above that, gravitating towards the most optimal and best specs is part of the game at the highest levels. So that's not the same as being viable. Like, at heroic level and Keystone Master level, and at whatever like the kind of like the base competitive PvP level is, I think all the classes are viable, and that's what viable means for me. I guess other people are going to have different criteria to that, right? Feral Druids in Mythic Plus is painful, even to get a Keystone Master. Is it though? But is it difficult to get Keystone Master because groups aren't taking you, or because you're not actually doing much damage? Because I bet actually you're absolutely fine. I bet damage-wise, and like what you bring to the group, you're completely viable. I bet the problem in getting Keystone Master is that people aren't taking you, and that's completely different. That's completely different from a class not being viable. That is the community perception of the highest level play filtering down into what viable like even means. Yeah, the problem is the meta mentality for sure. I'll admit I don't invite ferals. Well, I don't invite them because what's got to be wrong with you to play feral, right? It's nothing to do with the class. It's the person. It's all the person, right? Nothing to do with the class. Have to disagree. Keystone, Hero, CE, and Glad are part of the game. But so's... Well, no, so you think everything should be viable at the very highest levels of play? Really? You think everything should be viable at the very highest levels of play? At, like, the elite levels of play? I can't agree with that. I'm really sorry. I think, like, at the highest levels of play, choosing the right specs and choosing the right classes to take is literally part of the game. Part of high-level play is your composition. And I think that's all fine. I think that's right. It should be. Like, you want to take composition out of being part of, like, elite-level play. You know, that's like saying all positions in a football team should be equally viable. I should be allowed to play like one goalkeeper and like 10 midfielders, but all those positions should be viable, so that should be fine. It's like, no, composition is important. The formation you play in football is important. Not every formation is viable. And I feel like that's part of elite play in WoW. I feel like, you know, your group composition is something that people enjoy about the game at elite level. It's part of the game, in my opinion. And I think it's right that levels below that, it shouldn't be an issue. And that it should just be viable. Like, and every class should be viable. And I think it is. It's only my opinion. I disagree with you, but I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm not saying, like, your opinion isn't good. I play second goalkeeper in football. For some reason, no one accepts that as a role. I know, it's crazy. They should design each encounter to maximize different fantasies for all class types, but not all classes. Healers should feel important, etc. Yeah, but at the same time, like, you know, there are different kinds of fights as well. Like, you get patchwork fights. There are, like, fights that are very much focused on, like, sustained healing, and then there are fights that are focused on, like, burst healing and things like that. And likewise with DPS, and, you know, tanking's a funnier one, for sure. I remember Law saying at one point, if WoW classes were balanced around meta builds, the only class that'd be viable for everything is Balefire Mage. Composition of a group is important, but in my opinion, you should be able to create a successful group comp with different combos. I don't think there should only be a select few classes specs that are the successful combo. Here's the thing. Clearly, it is possible with different combos. When composition is part of the game, the elitist team is going to have a composition, and people are going to copy that. At what point does that become, well, other classes aren't viable and other combinations aren't viable? If the top 3 teams are all running the same combo and they're beating everyone, is that because of their combo, or is that because they're the top 3 teams? If they're running a combo which is beating everyone, are they beating everyone because of their combo, or are they beating everyone because they are literally just better than everyone else anyway? It's probably a bit of both, right? A shit group isn't suddenly going to finish Mythic Raid because they are using the meta specs. Exactly. And, like, just be clear, I actually firmly believe that any class spec currently in the game can actually be successful. I'm not sure about Glad. The idea of don't take X class spec ever until you're 24 or higher Mythic or your Mythic Raid group is what I take issue with. Yeah, exactly. And that's... I get in trouble when I say this now, Nat. But I'm going to say it anyway. It's kind of like a community issue, isn't it? Isn't it? If everything is viable, but people are still only taking meta specs, I don't really know how much we can blame the game for that. Inviting a feral won't make you fail. Yeah, but it might mean you end up going on a guild holiday with an absolute psycho. Just to be clear, it's not the class that I take umbrage with. That's not why I don't take ferals in groups. It's because the people that play feral, fuck those guys. I'm joking. I'm literally joking. I'm so joking. Like, the feral player in our guild is very, very lovely. Shilly is a good dude. I like him. I like him very much. I'm only joking. Clipped and shipped. Yeah, so every spec in the game has completed a plus 24 in time. Yeah, exactly. I think when you look at that evidence, is there any spec that hasn't got cutting edge? Has every spec got cutting edge? Has every spec done a plus 24? Because that's way beyond my criteria, by the way. My criteria is that you can do ahead of the curve and, like, you know, Keystone Master. But I wouldn't mind betting that at this stage, every spec has got cutting edge. Anyone can get carried? I mean, yeah, I guess. But then, I don't know, man. For me, if I had to take a bet on what class someone who pays for a mythic carry is playing, I would bet that they're playing a meta spec. If I had to literally bet, like, if someone said, I have just bought a mythic carry for cutting edge, what's my spec? I'd put my money on it being a fucking flavor of the month. It's just a feeling I have, just a gut feeling I have. I paid and I'm not meta, I'm just really bad at the game. Well, you prove me wrong. You prove me wrong. I don't mind being proven wrong. It's not. This isn't a theory I'm putting any weight into. I don't think there are more than 10 affliction warlocks doing progression on AFF. But has one of them got cutting edge though? Shots fired at the survival community. Yeah, it's okay. It's difficult with multi DPS specs because, yeah, it's that, like, likewise with disc. Everyone says disc is trash at the moment, and it's not. Discipline is absolutely fucking fine at the moment, but it's not as OP as Holy, right? So when you're playing a class and literally another spec that you can swap to just by pressing a button, you don't have to start a new character or anything like that, is like just you're going to have an easier time. A lot of people are going to do that, but that does not mean that the other spec isn't viable by any means. Like, Disc is absolutely fine. You can do anything on Disc right now. Holy is massively OP. I think being a one-spec pony shouldn't be the most viable playstyle. You choose a class, not a spec. Yeah, but I mean, then we are into our balancing thing, right? So then we are into the fact that, so say the classes are balanced, right? Say the specs are balanced. Say Frost is balanced with Fire. Now, why would you even want Frost to be balanced with Fire? Like, isn't the whole point of having different specs that they're good at different things? But whatever. Let's say that Fire and Frost are perfectly balanced. Now introduce the 4 set into the mix. All it takes is for the 4 set to be slightly better for one spec over the other, and suddenly it's not balanced anymore, right? And not only that, what are you actually balancing against? It's like, so Discipline Priest is good or bad in Raid, not even with how its numbers are balanced, but with how the timers on the bosses work. If bosses have predictable, timed damage that goes out, Disc is going to be better on that song. Better on that boss. If bosses have predictable timer damage that goes out once every 90 seconds exactly, Discipline is going to fucking destroy that boss. If the damage that goes out is random or depends on things that people in the raid do, Discipline is not going to be as good at that boss. And that's nothing to do with Discipline's numbers. That's nothing to do with Discipline's tuning. That's to do with its synergy with the bosses. And that's definitely the case in Sepulchre, the first ones. In Sanctum of Domination, the bosses were all timed perfectly to Discipline Priest. So it was awesome to play Discipline Priest in that, because like so many bosses had big predictable damage that went out every 90 seconds. So Disc was sitting there just like, yeah, fucking suck it. The tuning of Disc didn't have to change at all for Disc to be worse in Sepulchre, because the bosses were different. It's as simple as that. So that's what we're talking about when it comes to balance. It's not even anything to do with the actual classes half the time. It's like what the bosses give you. So, like, at what point do we say this is, like, what should Blizz be doing to make all of this viable and balanced? I don't even know. People are going to force others to play meta even if you don't want to, sadly. Why will others let you do it with a non-optimal spec? For you to have fun, for a very low chance the whole group fail. That's the meta mentality and will never disappear unless balance is close to perfect. Well, I mean, also, it's got a lot to do with kind of pug life as well. You know, if you take away Group Finder and you make everyone join a guild, I'm not suggesting you do this, by the way. I don't think you should. But if you were to take away Group Finder and, you know, if Discord didn't exist and you take away in-game communities and you make, or no, keep in-game communities, but you have like, you know, make everyone be in a raid or a community or a guild or a community to get their groups for Mythic Plus, you'd see a lot less meta specs being taken, a lot more non-meta specs being taken, because when you're on personal terms with someone, when you're in a guild with someone, when you're in a community with someone, you know them, you've played with them before. It's not the same thing as when you're taking on a complete random. And yeah, if you're looking at complete randoms to take onto your group, of course you're going to take what is seen as the better spec. You're shortening your odds of success. You know, you can win a poker hand with a pair of 7s, right? You're more likely to win a poker hand with a pair of aces. Just saying. So, like, when you don't know anything about the player, of course you're going to take the, like, in the same way you would take them, you're going to take the most geared, most meta spec, because you are looking at the things that will affect your chances of success. And you don't know anything about the player, so you can't take that into account. That's not one of the things you can account for, because you don't know the people who are applying on a personal level. You've never played with them before. They could be anything. So you go by the things that you can quantify, which are item level and the actual spec itself. That's not unfair. That's not unfair. But that doesn't mean that other specs aren't viable. And the thing is, the specs could be balanced to within 0.1% of each other. There are still going to be meta specs, and people are still going to take those meta specs because their reasoning for taking those meta specs in pugs would still be the same. The reason they're taking meta specs in pugs is because they are doing the best odds of success in the key on the limited information they have about the players. Even if a meta spec was only a meta spec by 0.1%, people would still be taking those meta specs in pugs over other specs. Even if something was non-meta by 0.1%, people would still not be taking those specs in pugs if they had other options for the exact same reasons they're doing it now. It's not anything to do with balance, it's community perception. Like, the times you can actually say that something is really badly balanced are memorable. They're so rare in 36 specs. And that's pretty good, in my opinion, And again, like, that's back to the original topic of the conversation. That's why analytics should be banned. Well, I don't know, man. I mean, I quite like being able to analyze how I'm doing. So I don't know. I don't know what to do. But back to the original statement, which was that if WoW did live letters like Final Fantasy XIV do with Yoshi and the producer, you know, inevitably, and we did see this in the Q&As, inevitably it would come back round to class balance all the time, because that makes up so much more of the conversation in the community than it does in Final Fantasy XIV, because there's so many more variables in WoW, with talents and with tier sets and with trinkets and with the fact that a lot more people play the game like in a competitive way compared to Final Fantasy XIV. What you're saying is that fix for balance complaints is better in-game moderation. I don't know if that's what I'm saying. I don't know if that's what I'm saying. No, I don't know if there's an answer to it, really. Because, you know, we all say that having that kind of variety in build variety and the options and choices, whenever I know Preach doesn't do WoW anymore, but every time you'd watch a Preach video, his mantra when it came to WoW would be choice. Give us choice in our characters. Let us swap out like talents and abilities and things so that we can do different things and like make our characters better at different things, like better at AoE or better at single target when they want to be and things like that. And it's a mantra in the WoW community, particularly the higher ends, that choice is a good thing. But you look at Final Fantasy XIV, there is zero choice. Every Dragoon is the same. Every Gunbreaker is the same. So what is it we actually want? Do we want a choice or not? And if you're going to have a choice, well, we have to accept that it's going to be much harder to balance, and it's going to take up a much larger proportion of the conversation when it comes to that game. Sorry, I wasn't being clear. What I meant was that getting the community to behave better. Oh yeah, for sure. For sure. Yeah, no, I understand that. Sorry, yeah. I just don't. I think you can get the community to behave better, but I don't think you can ever get them to not take the meta specs over the less meta specs. Like I say, even if the meta specs are only meta by 0.1%, I just don't think you're ever going to get them to take the one that's 0.1% less good over the one that is 0.1% more good when you don't know anything else about the player. That's why the best advice, and I know no one ever wants to hear this, you know, it's like fad dieters, right? People are like, what's the best like way to lose weight quickly? What they want is for someone to say, this magic diet pill that's been invented will sort you out, you'll lose all the weight super quickly. What they don't want anyone to say is the actual truth, which is exercise and just eat healthier. And it's the same with WoW. What no one ever wants to hear is find a guild. Get in a good guild. Get in a guild, make friends, or, you know, at least just get to know people. And that is unfortunately the truth. And no one ever wants to hear it. And there are legitimately very good reasons why some people can't be in guilds. I know, because I've played on time zones and I've played in regions where my time zones were so different from everyone else on the region that I just couldn't raid. I couldn't do it. And that's why I had to change regions to the EU in the end. But it's unfortunately the truth. The best advice you can ever give anyone in WoW is join a guild. By the way, I think that's the best advice you can give someone in Final Fantasy XIV as well. But like so many of the things that are listed as problems with WoW are solved if you just join a good guild. And I don't mean good as in filled with good players. I mean good as in nice. Right, but with a less toxic community overall, it would hopefully be easier to get a guild. Oh yeah, 100%. No, I agree with your overall point. I absolutely do, yeah. And, the detoxifying of the community should absolutely be a priority. Do you think it's Blizzard's responsibility to detoxify the community, or is that the community's responsibility? Well, I think Blizzard absolutely have to provide the tools to allow the community to detoxify itself. At the end of the day, the responsibility lies with the community, but Blizzard's responsibility is making it as easy as possible for players to do that. Something that they're never going to do, have more GMs. Having more GMs in the game at any one time would be the best way of doing it, to respond to reports in real time, to respond to problems in real time. That's not something they do enough of. And that is something that they absolutely have to take some blame for sure. In terms of, like, do they foster toxicity with the fact that there were competitive elements to the game? It's a harder thing to quantify, isn't it? But I think WoW's in kind of like a unique position, because how many other games are 20 years old? Like, there's no doubt that internet culture and just societal culture is different now than it was 20 years ago. Just like it was different in the 90s than it was in the 70s, right? Like, the culture was very different in the 90s to how it was in the 70s. Loads of things were really acceptable in the 70s that weren't acceptable in the 90s. You know, and that's the comparison we've got here. We're talking about a game that is 20 years old and has not changed. Like, the game is the same game. You've had expansions, but it's the same game. What other game has still got its community from 20 years ago in the same game? Basically none that has this many players. So you've got that thing where people started playing this exact game 20 years ago when the culture was very, very different. Like, they go into a new game, they adopt, like, today's culture. They go into a game that they've been playing for 20 years, it's like they go back to being the culture they were 20 years ago. In a way, some people. It's a challenge that other games don't really face to the same degree.